All right. Welcome to another episode of my running education series. Today we're going to talk about the importance of running slow. And this is kind of paradoxical because you would think we'd want to talk about running faster, right? And we do want to run faster, but we want to run faster in the race. That's when we want to essentially run faster. That's our goal. Or we want to run faster when we perform whatever it is that we're training for, which for most of us is typically a race. Now, I encourage you, if you have not, to go back to my past running education lessons. I did one on interval training, which is kind of the exact opposite of what we're going to talk about today. And interval training is still very, very important. And I also did one on recovery, and I did one on a few other topics as well. So I encourage you to go back and look at that. I think that this is episode 4. It could possibly even be episode 5. All right, so let's get right into it. The importance of running slow. Let's talk about young runners. If you ever go to a 5K or maybe a 2-mile race, oftentimes what you'll see is you'll see a bunch of young runners, anywhere from 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and they line up right at the front. And when the gun goes off to start the race, they all just take off as fast as they can. And most of them can maintain that pace for about 50 to 100 yards. And then after that, they slowly die down and fade away, right? It's a lesson that every young runner has to learn, and that everybody has to learn, the whole idea of pacing yourself in a race. And I certainly learned that when I was younger as well. I remember when I used to do the Sheboygan Turkey Trot when I was 9 or 10, I would just take off as fast as I could, maybe get a quarter of a mile and then stop puffing and walking, right? Young runners typically have a really hard time with the idea of running slow. And when a lot of high school runners or middle school runners, even collegiate runners, are practicing or they're just going on a run, they oftentimes get the idea that there's a certain pace that they have to meet, and oftentimes that pace is faster than what the objective of the workout is. And oftentimes, when you include groups together and you have a group of runners going together, it oftentimes turns into a race. I remember when I was in cross country, anytime we were doing an easy run, and for us, it was from the high school I went to Lake Michigan, which was about 3 miles. And we called it our Lake Michigan run. And it was supposed to just be an easy run. It always turned into a race, even if it was the day after a race. We'll talk about why that's very dangerous to do that. But it actually takes discipline to run slow. It takes discipline to run slow. It takes discipline not to push the pace. And it takes discipline to get into the rhythm of a nice, easy, slow run. That actually takes discipline. A guy by the name of Dr. Jack Daniels, the best, in my opinion, running coach that ever existed, had the quote that you should always know the purpose of the workout. And that's going to tie into what we're going to talk about today. Then a guy by the name of Dr. Jason Karp, who I read a lot of, and another very, very top credible coach in the United States for distance running, says that you want to run at the slowest pace possible to achieve the purpose of the workout. And that's so important that you look at the purpose of the workout. You always should have a purpose. And the goal of the athlete and coach should be getting that athlete to run at the slowest pace possible to achieve the purpose of that workout. If your goal is to do a lactate threshold run, you want to run at the slowest pace possible, faster than your lactate threshold pace, so that you meet the goal of the workout. And some cases, the goal may be to run 10 seconds faster than your lactate threshold pace. Some cases, it might be to run at that lactate threshold pace. But there's never an advantage to running a workout faster than the intended purpose, because you should always trust the plan and the design of your training program. If you trust the plan and design of your training program, either from you as your own coach or a coach that you're following, if you really have faith and trust in them, there's no reason to run that workout faster than what the intended pace was, right? Just complete the workout at the intended pace, and if you feel good, you feel good. If you ever want to drop out of a workout because it's just not your day, that's okay too. Never feel bad about dropping out of a workout because you're not feeling well or it's not your day. But there's never a reason to go harder than what you intended, right? There's never a reason to go longer than what you intended either, okay? Running slow takes discipline. And as far as I know, I was the one that came up with that quote. I'm sure somebody else said it out there. But again, running slow, running at that pace that you desired, that takes discipline. Why should you run slow? Well, a couple of things here. Number one, it reduces your risk of injury. oftentimes runners, when they do workouts too hard and it's just supposed to be a recovery run or an easy run, then the ligaments don't get the recovery that they were supposed to get. The ligaments get overused more then, and that increases your risk of injury. When you run slow, that actually helps your capillaries and your mitochondria develop. And we talked about that in a previous workshop that I did, where you actually get more capillaries, more mitochondria that develop, and that happens as a function of time spent running, not as a function of speed. So if the goal is to develop capillary and mitochondria, which by the way factor into your aerobic engine, then you don't need to run fast, so run slow, because you're gonna be able to run longer than if you run slow, and you're going to get the best capillary mitochondria development from that. Your stroke volume of your heart, which is the amount of blood that leaves the heart with each beat, reaches a maximum at just 60% of your max heart rate, which is your conversational pace. So again, if your stroke volume is reaching its peak at just 60%, then that's a really good point for you to do your running at, because you're getting the maximum stroke volume, which is going to help your heart become stronger. And it's the easiest way to build an aerobic engine for younger runners, which is very important. When runners are younger, they have to develop that aerobic engine. And the easiest way to do that is lots of long, slow, easy running. And in the long, slow, easy running is not the cool part of running. It's not the part of running where runners typically like, because it's not as exciting, but it's really where the development happens and where you get that aerobic engine. Let me just check to make sure I'm still connected here. Looks as if I am, so we'll keep going. Awesome. So a little bit of a story. Friend of mine, and hopefully he doesn't watch this, but I don't think he would mind. He's a college cross country coach, and he was telling me one day that he was bragging to me that all of his runs, no matter if it's an easy run or a lactate threshold run, whenever he went on a run, he was bragging to me that it's always under 8 minutes. And he never runs slower than 8 minutes. And he's a guy that he looks at his watch, and he's always focused on the pace. He's always making sure he's running fast enough. He's always setting a goal that this run, no matter what it is, has to be under a certain pace. And he's very focused on the watch. And he's like many runners. Many runners are the same way. But that's not always the best thing to do, right? Because what matters is who runs faster in the race, right? That's what we're training for. That's what matters. It's who runs faster in the race, not who runs faster at practice, not who runs faster during easy runs. It's who's going to win that race, right? I always say that I have a hard time, if I have an easy run, doing it on a track, because then other runners may pass me, and I kind of feel sometimes like I'm in a race, right? I try not to look around. I'm the same way when I swim laps. I try to just stay focused on what I'm doing, not look at what the person in the lane next to me is doing. But if I start looking, that does get in my head a little bit. I remember when I was reading about Steve Prefontaine, he would talk about how he had to, even if it was just an easy run, or even if it was just a short little race around a track for fun with kids, he would have to make sure he finished first, because he would feel it gets in his head if he didn't, right? But remember, it's always about the race that actually matters, not who wins at practice. When I was in cross country, one of my friends and I used to always duke it out at practice during intervals and stuff, but during the race, I had a hard time beating him. Even if I would beat him at practice, he'd still beat me in the race. And that's what ultimately matters. So there's a saying that a lot of coaches like to use with athletes that coach sports like basketball and football and all that, and that is, we play like we practice, right? That is not true with distance running. You don't have to run at race pace for all your workouts. You don't race at the same pace you practice. And so that idea has to get out of our heads with distance running. When runners go in groups, that can be very, very dangerous. And there's a reason for that. And let me just make sure I'm still connected. I heard something beep. Yep, stay in the call. Okay, got it. Sometimes it disconnects me when that happens. But when runners run in groups, it can be dangerous. And oftentimes, a lot of runners say, I need to run in groups because it motivates me. But if the group does not have specific designated paces, that can be dangerous, because everyone's at a different level, which means everyone should run at a different pace if they're trying to achieve the same purpose. Okay, if I join a group of collegiate Division I distance runners for an easy run, their easy run pace is probably going to be at my VO2 max pace. Okay. So that's not good, right? And that's why we have to be very cautious about training in groups. If we're running in groups, we have to make sure that we're running with people that are at the same level we are. And if not, we have to adjust the workout for our individual self. Very important. But oftentimes when younger runners get in groups, high school, middle school, even collegiate, it turns into a race. And there's a lot of in that somebody pushes a pace and then the other runners feel like they have to keep up. We have to make sure that doesn't happen. So something to be aware of. Now, the great paradox is that running slower actually makes you faster. 80-20 polarized training is somewhat true and somewhat not true. That's a training that says 80% of the runs should be run at a slow pace, 20% of the runs should be run at an easy pace. Or actually, it's better to say 80% of the mileage versus 20% of the mileage. But that's actually not always true, and that can be a dangerous concept to use because that is based on how many total miles or the total volume of miles that you're running. So the more miles that you run, the more miles are going to be run at an easy pace, right? So if you're running, say 50 miles a week, you're going to run more of those miles at an easy pace than if a person's just running 20 miles a week. Okay. So again, the 80-20 idea is very popular. You hear coaches talking about that all the time, but it's not always true because it's based on the volume of mileage, right? So when you take elite runners that are running upwards of 100 miles a week, okay, they're not doing 20% of those miles at a hard pace. They're doing maybe 5 to 10% of those miles at a hard pace. Okay. And again, I don't want to underemphasize the importance of intervals, tempo runs, running below lactate threshold. All of that does serve a purpose, but there's also a great purpose to just running easy and keeping the pace very, very slow. Okay. And of course, at different times of the year, you're going to be in different macro cycles. Your training is going to change as you get in your season, as the beginning of the season begins or the end of the season. That's all going to change. So when should you run slow? All easy runs should be run slow, of course. During long distance running, when you're doing a long run, so if you're marathon training and you're doing, your long run, or if you're getting a long run in, even if you're just training for a 5K, you're getting your long run in, it should be done at a slow pace. During a cool down of a race or interval workout, and during the warm up, at least early on in the warm up, if you want to finish off the warm up with a little bit of a harder pace to get your heart pumping a little bit, that's okay. But again, during the beginning phases of the warm up, whatever you're warming up for, it should be run at a very slow pace. So let's get into this a little bit. I want to talk just a little bit about the different types of training that you can do when we talk about easy and slow and intervals and stuff. The myth is that you always want to begin a training plan with low intensity before moving to higher intensity. The truth is, depending upon the individual and goals, moving from higher intense training to lower intense training may be more effective. And that's kind of opposite what we oftentimes think. And there's different approaches to this. We have linear training theory, which is known as Soviet Union training theory, which says that you go from a high volume of low intensity and you transition to a low volume of higher intensity. And that's how the Soviet Union trained their speed skaters using that approach. So it became very common after that. Reverse linear training is when you begin with high intensity, low volume. So you begin more with speed, but you do less of it. And then you transition to lower intensity and higher volume. Now, the past history and the individual goals should determine the plan that's best for the individual. And these aren't the only two plans, by the way. There's several other plans as well. What they say is if you're transitioning to a marathon, you might be better off doing a reverse linear training because you finish off with what you're going to be doing in the race, right? If you're training for a mile, you might be better off doing regular linear training because you finish off with what you're going to be doing more likely in the race and sprinkling in speed at the end. So that's important as well. All right, so that's the lesson for the day. Have a wonderful day, and hopefully you learned something.